The movie starts with a scene depicting the rundown town of Coat Rock following the closure of the local mine, leaving the townsfolk unemployed. In this morning's scene, a local resident named Tracy brings her 2 daughters to nurse Julia. Tracy's eldest daughter, Carol, is in labor, while her younger daughter, Jenny, who is able to talk, doodles in a notebook about the unborn baby. When the baby boy is born, Jenny indicates that he doesn't have a future in this town. Tracy immediately refuses to hospitalize her underage daughter, as the child was conceived from Carol's relationship with Steve, who had been showing interest in the girls for a while. However, Tracy is also not inclined to push Steve away, stating that they will handle the situation on their own. On the way home, the family passes by a stand displaying pictures of missing children, whose disappearances locals attribute to a kidnapper known as Brazil. According to their estimations, this kidnapper abducts children regularly, every 2 months. Julia arrives to examine the newborn and overhears Stephen mentioning that he and Carol had an arrangement. The nurse advises not to dwell on it. Just to remind you, the actual doctor was her late husband Tracy, but she claims she sent her daughter and grandchild to relatives in another city since she couldn't manage them at the moment. Julie discovers the second girl, Jenny, by the river. Jenny doesn't speak, but Julie communicates with her through a notebook. Jenny indicates through a drawing that she personally saw the kidnapper himself. The police have been trying to catch him for a long time, including the pillbox lieutenant whom Julia encounters in a local cafe. Later, a disheveled resident, Mrs. Johnson, appears at the diner. She declines the nurse's help and heads back home after finishing her errands. Julia arrives home where she meets the nanny, Christine, and her son, David. They spend time playing until dinner. After putting David to bed, Julia fondly remembers her late husband with a kind word. Nanny Christine offers them a drink, and Julia, now intoxicated, falls asleep on the sofa with a book. She wakes up to a loud sermon on the radio and discovers Christine tied up on the kitchen floor. Panicked, she rushes to the nursery but finds David missing. Returning to the kitchen, she sees the kidnapper holding her son. Julia chases after the big guy driving away from her house in a van. She even manages to hang on to him for a while, but the van suddenly stops in the middle of the road. Julia tries to rescue her son from the kidnapper, but struggles with the assailant, whom she somehow overcomes with the help of a stone. However, the kidnapper knocks her out and swaps her son for another child, taking him to her cabin. Julia, noticing holes in the back, frees herself from her bonds and attacks the driver, causing an accident. David, the first to exit the van, is followed by the kidnapper, who calmly carries the boy away from the scene while Julia arrives on a bicycle. Jenny, deciding not to intervene, drives past. There were 6 vans involved. Julia spots signs of the kidnapper on the road and follows them into the woods. But there, she finds nothing except a homemade totem with the inscription, "Big Man." Disappointed, she heads back to the road where she discovers the lieutenant lying unconscious. She speculates that the attacker might be someone he's been pursuing for a while. Julia takes him to a nearby diner for help, where the sheriff takes charge of the situation. As Julia sits in the corner of the cafe, feeling shaken, the policeman steps out to speak with a man named Douglas. The other patrons start giving Julia suspicious looks, until the owner of the establishment invites the nurse to go and wash her face in her office. Having freshened up, Julia overhears how the hard worker convinces the sheriff and starts leading her into the mine for a conversation. Inside the room, she discovers notes about missing children and a photo of her son David. Meanwhile, the visitors are barely restraining themselves from breaking into the nurse's space. When Douglas can't take it anymore, he realizes that Julia has already escaped, prompting the angry crowd to pour out of the cafe armed and set off in pursuit. The sheriff drives to some partially destroyed residential building, and as they go inside, Julia slips out of his car. The man assures someone that the fugitive will soon be caught and leaves. The woman enters the house after wandering through the hallways. Julia suddenly runs into David, who guides her somewhere, and then the woman is shocked. The kidnapper turns out to be Mrs. Johnson, whom the nurse saw earlier at the diner, holding a boy named Julia in her arms. Julia finds herself tied to a chair with Mrs. Johnson, who explains that David was brainwashed and told that his mother had died. She reveals that she was searching for her son in the forest, where they encountered the large man. After passing by, she went to Julia's house, where she spotted her missing boy through the window. In the morning, a woman approached the cafe owner, Trish, asking for David, but encountered a nurse instead. After exchanging a glance, she left to await the kidnapper's departure. Eventually, Johnson informed Trish of everything, promising that she would bring her son back that night. However, instead of the woman and her son, they brought Julia. The cafe owner then informed the patrons about the kidnapper, and they wanted to handle the situation themselves. They resorted to clinchers. Mrs. Johnson decided because of distrust of the police, who once evicted her from the house due to non-payment, and she was forced to move here. When asked where the rest of Julie's missing children were, she replies that she gave them away to the big guys, but whoever he says refuses. When the woman distracts her son, the nurse knocks her out and begins to unravel, which is why the frightened David runs away and hides behind the wall in the corridor, where he is found by the non-speaking Jenny, who nevertheless tracked down Julia. However, when the girl meets the kidnapper in the hallway, she unexpectedly gives him the boy's sister and runs with her to the street where, with the help of Iskra, she starts a parked pickup truck for them. Trinity arrives at Julia's place and informs Christine that they've been declassified. He mentions that soon the whole city will be there, and then he hands over David to her so she can get him ready to leave. Suddenly, Jenny pleads with the woman to take her to the big man, even falling to her knees in front of her. The nanny injects something into the boy and learns from Julia that it's a girl who's been keeping an eye on her for several weeks. So, he knows about her connection with the bruiser. Sister picks up David and carries him to the basement. After some time, she returns. Julia approaches Jenny and whispers that she gave the thug the girl's address, hoping he'll take her if she keeps quiet. She then heads upstairs, ignoring the screams from outside the door. She doesn't retire early, not with the christening looming. I gather there isn't one. In the morning, as Julia, in handcuffs, is escorted down the corridor, she sees her friend's lifeless body, having committed suicide. Then, the abductor is paraded through angry townspeople demanding to know where their children are. Lieutenant Sheriff Honest is there. They discover in the basement of a nurse, one of the city mines, beneath which her house was situated. The mine just served as a passage to somewhere outside. The detective interrogates the suspect, who claims she only took children from terrible conditions and brought them forcefully to her nursery, providing them with books and toys to give them a proper childhood. She insists she acted alone and denies the existence of any accomplices. However, when asked about the whereabouts of the children and whether they are alive or not, Julia refuses to testify further. The lieutenant then asks the mother of David, the last missing child, to speak. During the meeting, Julia tells her that she only took children from dysfunctional families to help them break out of the cycle of abuse, stating that the state had neglected these children's fate for too long, and their families haven't cared about the main thing, whether the children are alive or kidnapped. The nurse still answers in the negative. After that, she receives a life sentence, surrounded by women who hate her. At night, Jenny watches her parents drunkenly quarrel, and when she stands up for her mother, her stepfather throws her away. Tracy hits Stephen with a bottle, telling him not to touch her daughter anymore, after which the couple suddenly starts laughing. The girl runs away in disgust, and just as she's about to return, she hears some rustling near the old barn, where a thug grabs her. She managed to break free from the cycle of poverty and abuse, and finally, mentally thanked her adoptive mother for giving her the life she had only dreamed of. Jenny attends art school, and while walking through the park, she locks eyes with David, who now lives with another family far from his own. He thinks about the second mother, Julie. Jenny goes to art school, and on the way through the park meets the eyes of David, now also living in another family far from her mother, after which she asks herself whether what's happening to her now is really right. See you soon.